In this episode of Death Row Diaries, we're going deep into one of Florida's most disturbing family annihilation cases. We'll walk you through Edward Zakreski's life, the shocking triple murder of his wife and two children, his bizarre escape to a Hawaiian religious commune, the twisted courtroom defense, and finally, the moment he was strapped to a gurney and served his last meal. We'll reveal exactly what he ate, what he said just before dying, and why his execution was unlike any other. But first, let's rewind to the beginning, to a man who looked like the picture of discipline and control, but behind closed doors was anything but. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Edward James Zakreski II was the kind of man who didn't raise eyebrows. He was responsible, neatly groomed, and quietly spoken. A technical sergeant in the United States Air Force. Dependable, stable, respected. He met his wife, Poon Im, while stationed in Montana in 1986. She was South Korean, and he was smitten. When she got pregnant, the two got married. Poon Im took on an American name, Sylvia, and the couple began building what looked like a promising life together. Eventually, they had two children, a son, Edward III, nicknamed Kim, and a daughter, Anna. Over the years, Zakreski was moved from post to post, including a 3-year deployment in South Korea, followed by a transfer to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The family settled in the small, peaceful town of Mary Esther in Okaloosa County. Neighbors described the Zakreskis as a quiet family, private but polite. There were no loud arguments, no police calls, no red flags, at least none that anyone saw. But what the neighbors didn't see was the growing resentment behind that suburban front door. Sylvia had struggled, first with discrimination in South Korea for marrying an American, then with isolation in the United States. Their marriage had become increasingly strained. Sylvia wanted more freedom, more say, more independence. And Edward? He wanted control. By 1994, the marriage was crumbling. Sylvia had a plan, and once Edward found out, everything changed. On the morning of June 9, 1994, Sylvia made her decision. She was going to divorce Edward, and not only that, she was going to take the kids and move back to South Korea. Her son, Kim, called his father at work to let him know. That phone call was the spark. Edward, already consumed with suspicion and paranoia, snapped. Divorce wasn't just a rejection, it was a threat. The idea of his children growing up in a foreign country without him, maybe even calling another man dad, was unbearable. So, during his lunch break, he made a choice. He walked into a local hardware store and bought a machete. Calmly, quietly, as if shopping for garden tools, he then went home, gathered a crowbar and some rope, and stashed them in the bathroom. He waited. When Sylvia and the kids got home that evening, they had no idea what was waiting for them. No idea that their husband and father, this clean-cut military man, had transformed into a killer. No warning, just death. It started with Sylvia. Edward attacked her with the crowbar, striking her repeatedly. Then, using the rope, he strangled her. But he didn't stop there. He dragged her into the bathroom and used the machete to mutilate her body, ensuring she was dead. Then, he turned to his children. First, 7-year-old Kim. He called him into the bathroom under the pretense of brushing his teeth. Routine, innocent. Once inside, Edward brought down the machete. Again and again. Kim fought back. His arms and hands showed defensive wounds, but the machete tore through his head, neck, and back. He died in that blood-slick bathroom, just feet from his mother's mutilated body. Then came 5-year-old Anna. The same lie, the same routine. She too was lured in, trusting her father, and she too was butchered. She had no chance. Her tiny body was covered in slash wounds. She died alone, in pain, in terror. But the most haunting detail? Edward killed Anna last. According to prosecutors, she likely saw her brother's body. She might have even heard his screams. That image, a 5-year-old girl realizing her father was about to kill her, is seared into the minds of everyone who studied this case. 3 bodies, 1 house, no survivors. Edward Zakreski didn't panic. He didn't call 911. He didn't break down. He packed a bag and vanished. After the murders, Zakrzewski drove to Orlando and boarded a flight to Hawaii. There he changed his name to Michael Green and checked into the fringes of society. He ended up in a religious commune run by a minister who let him stay in a shack in exchange for labor and maintenance work. Edward kept to himself. He didn't draw attention. He blended in. Back in Florida, investigators quickly figured out who was responsible. When Edward failed to report for duty, he was listed as AWOL. When they went to the house, what they found was a scene of unspeakable horror. The search was on, but months passed. No leads. Then came a break. 4 months after the murders, Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode about the Zakrzewski family massacre. Edward's face was broadcast to millions, and someone watching recognized him. The minister in Hawaii looked over at Michael Green and made a chilling realization. The next day, October 15, 1994, Edward Zakrzewski walked into a police station and turned himself in. The manhunt was over. But the real battle, the legal one, was just beginning. If you're still watching, you're the kind of person who doesn't look away from the truth, no matter how dark it gets. Hit that like button to help us reach more true crime fans like you. And drop a comment. How would you describe Edward Zakrzewski in 1 word? Edward Zakrzewski had remained quiet for years. No appeals to the media, no teary-eyed TV interviews. Just a man silently waiting in the shadows of Florida's death row. But in 1999, 5 years after the murders, Zakrzewski finally broke his silence. Not in court, not on camera, but through a handwritten letter addressed to the judge. And what he admitted was nothing short of chilling. In the letter, Edward said he'd murdered his wife and children because he felt like a failure. He wrote that his marriage was falling apart and he couldn't bear the thought of losing control. He feared Cindy might take the kids and leave him behind. So, in his warped mind, eliminating them meant ending the pain. He claimed he'd suffered from depression, that he'd tried to end his own life multiple times before the murders. But that final week in June 1994, something inside him snapped, and instead of taking his own life, he took theirs. But there was something else even more disturbing in that confession. Edward admitted he'd waited hours between killing his wife and murdering his children. He had time to reconsider, time to run, time to stop, but he didn't. He changed clothes. He made sure the neighbors wouldn't hear. He deliberately muffled the sound. And when he walked into the children's room, he knew exactly what he was about to do. His confession made it clear this wasn't an impulsive act of rage. It was calculated. And even more unsettling? Zakreski said he didn't expect to live much longer after the murders. He figured he'd be caught, or maybe he hoped to be. But when he fled to Hawaii and started building a new life, it became obvious he was planning to run until the very end. So why confess? Why admit all this after years of silence? Some speculated it was remorse. Others believed he wanted control again. He wanted to tell his side, on his terms. But the families of Cindy and the children didn't buy it. To them, it was too little, too late. His confession didn't bring closure. It reopened wounds. And if you thought the horror ended with his words, think again. Zakrzewski's days on death row were long, cold, and lonely. Unlike many high-profile killers who receive letters, fan mail, or media attention, Zakrzewski faded into obscurity. He rarely communicated with other inmates. He didn't take part in religious services or art programs. For nearly 30 years, he lived like a ghost in a concrete tomb, waiting for the inevitable knock on the cell door. He filed one major appeal, arguing ineffective counsel. He claimed that his legal team failed to fully investigate his mental health, that his depression and suicidal ideation should have been stronger mitigating factors. But the courts weren't swayed. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case multiple times and upheld the death sentence. Federal courts did the same. One judge wrote in his opinion, "The brutality of the crime far outweighs any mitigating circumstance. This was not just murder, it was annihilation." Zakrzewski's behavior on death row remained cold and mechanical. Prison officials described him as polite but vacant. He followed orders, ate his meals, spoke only when spoken to. He never once expressed remorse in any public forum. Over time, his name disappeared from the headlines. New cases filled the airwaves, and Zakrzewski's story became just another file in the archives of Florida's most brutal killers, until the execution date was finally set in 2025. And that's when the world looked back at him once more. In May 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Edward Zakrzewski's death warrant. It had been 34 years since the murders. The announcement sparked immediate reaction. True crime forums exploded. News outlets replayed footage from the 90s. Old neighbors were interviewed. Survivors gave tearful statements. And there was something different about this case, something that made the public lean in closer. Zakrzewski wasn't just a murderer. He was a father, a husband, a former military man, and he slaughtered the very people he was supposed to protect. Online, people debated. Was the death penalty enough, or was it too easy? Some said he should have rotted in prison forever. Others said justice was long overdue. But no one could look away. On July 31st, 2025, reporters gathered outside Florida State Prison.
It was sweltering hot. Protesters on both sides lined the gates, some holding signs that read, "Justice for the children," while others called for the abolition of capital punishment. And inside, Zakreski was preparing for the final moments of his life. Inmates on death row in Florida are allowed to choose a last meal as long as it doesn't exceed $40 and can be prepared locally. Zakreski's request was oddly simple: fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, toast, root beer, ice cream, pie, and coffee. A Southern comfort meal. No dessert, no extravagant requests, just something familiar, something almost ordinary. As the guards walked him to the execution chamber, he remained calm, no resistance, no panic. At 6:01 p.m., Zakreski was strapped to the gurney. He glanced at the witnesses through the glass. Some were reporters, others were family members of his victims. There were no visible signs of emotion on his face. When asked if he had any last words, he spoke slowly and clearly. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible. I have no complaints whatsoever." The execution phase got underway after he spoke, at about 6:04 p.m. His breathing slowed nearly immediately after a few hard gasps, and he was pronounced dead by 6:13 p.m. Edward Zakreski's case is one of the most haunting in American criminal history, not because of the brutality alone, but because of the betrayal. He was the protector who became the predator, a husband who silenced his wife, a father who ended his children's futures before they began. And for what? Fear, control, ego. Perhaps we'll never know the full reason, but what we do know is this: justice may take decades, but it never forgets. If you found this story disturbing but important, subscribe to Death Row Diaries, where we uncover the darkest crimes, the final moments, and the hidden truths behind the world's most notorious executions. And let us know in the comments, do you think justice was truly served, or was 3 decades too long to wait? Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.